Let's start. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Chicago Booth Angels Network event. Thank you all for your interest in today's event. My name is Natalia Kolupaeva. I'm a portfolio manager at the family office Opportunity Global. I am also a Chicago Booth alum. I and Michael Sklarov, we lead the Chicago Booth Angels Network of Russia. A little bit about this organization. We are alumni-run community of business angels, investors into startups and VC funds. And our goal is to fuel the success of the community, Booth community, all over the world through knowledge sharing and connection building. I will be a moderator of today's event. Our topic is BioTech VC, how these VC funds make money. And our special guests today are Andrey Kozlov and Dmitry Kuzmin. They are managing partners and founding partners at 4Bio Capital, a London-based investment firm focused exclusively on advanced therapy. Andrey is a Chicago Booth alum. I know him personally for many years. He has more than 20 years experience in finance and investments, and he has extended knowledge in private equity and venture capital. Dmitry leads a technical team of this biotech VC fund, and he is responsible for sourcing, evaluation, and post-investment management of both private and public investments. Before joining this company and founding this company, Dmitry spent many years in academia, focusing on structural biology, neurochemistry, systems neuroscience, brain-computer interfaces, and gene therapy. Dmitry and Andrey are board members of several pharma companies, and I think they will add more details during the presentation. I think we will start presentation first, and then Andrey and Dmitry will answer your questions. You may send your questions during the presentation using a Zoom chat. I think we will have about 60 minutes for this event, and we may start. Dmitry and Andrey, please.
Right. Yeah, let me start a little bit and then pass the mic to Dima. So yeah, my name is Andrey Kozlov. I've graduated back in 2008, so a while ago already. Initially went, as many of us do, to investment banking, to finance world, but pretty quickly switched to buy side and ended up investing in biotechnology. And back in 2015, Dima and myself, we have established a venture capital fund, investing only in biotech early stage and mid stage biotech companies. And why we actually have organized this event, it's interesting that this huge VC market and biotech market is under the radars of many people who work in finance, and there are a lot of misperceptions. And by talking with Natalia, we realized it may be interesting to kind of everybody and to Booth alumni as well. So yeah, I will pass the mic to Dima. He will prepare a few slides for you, and then we'll make sure to have time to answer your questions. Yeah, Dima.
So hi everybody. As Natasha said, I'm a physician scientist and an Oxford graduate, so this is a bit of an invasion of this a comfortable space of a lot of very smart financiers. So I hope we'll entertain and educate you a little bit today. And we'll share some of the misconceptions about the biotech market and how the biotech market operates, and then how do we actually make money in it. So perhaps the most important thing about biotech is it's widely misunderstood and misperceived, actually. So when people think about the healthcare market and the way it operates, they think a couple of things. They think big pharma, they think vaccines, 5G, Bill Gates conspiracy theories, And in general, they think that this is something very remote and doesn't really touch anybody's life. So I find this data set fascinating. That's been put together by our World in Data back in 2016. And if you think about what the media covers in the United States and what people search for as the causes of death in the United States, as well as the cause of major health issues, media covers 35% of the time, terrorism, 22%, homicide, and 10% suicide. And the rest of it is kind of less than 50%, which are the health issues. When we turn to Googling, there's more cancer, because cancer is long-term and quite scary throughout. But heart disease, which kills 30% of Americans, and actually roughly 30 to 35% of people in the world, it takes up 2% Googling and 2% of media coverage. So it's completely invisible. And so it is for most other diseases. So the issue of chronic disease, which is hugely destructive, which is destroying our healthcare systems and rapidly bankrupting them, and also which touches every human being on Earth, sadly, is not getting the amount of attention it should really be getting. As a result of that, a typical lay person, as well as a typical investor or business person, is significantly more attuned to the tech market and the things that they can touch and experience firsthand within the confines of their normal life, as they are to the healthcare market and biotech. And so people typically think that this is a smaller market than many others. On the contrary, though, this is a 2.6 trillion market in therapeutics alone, and it typically occupies in between 20 and 30% of limited partner allocations as far as venture and private equity go. So it is roughly on par with the tech market in terms of the LP capital being deployed. So it is a very large market that is, by and large, invisible to many people. Because of that, people often misunderstand how does it actually operate. So I do apologize to those on this webinar who are actually active in the biopharma market, and I know there are a few, but we'll walk the audience through what it actually takes to develop a novel medicine. And then we can go a little bit more in depth and discuss how do people actually make money on that. Very importantly, before anything remotely business-like shows up in this whole biopharma story, there is lots of bench research, laboratory-based bench research that goes into this. As of last year, Elsevier estimated that there is about $10 million of taxpayer or charitable money spent on any drug before venture capitalists touch it. And mind you, venture capitalists actually touch most drugs in the world. For every one drug that's approved within the hands of big pharma that's been developed in-house, 4.8 are developed by venture-backed startups. So the vast majority of novel drugs actually come from venture. So before we get somewhere, there is a lab, there is a professor and a sort of PhD students and postdocs actually doing bench research. What do they research? They do something that's called translational life sciences. So they find novel targets, they find novel mechanisms of action, they find novel molecule classes, but most importantly, they're doing curiosity-driven research. So they're not interested in turning this into particular small molecules or antibodies or gene therapies. What they're interested in is primarily generating novel data, novel science, researching how this whole stuff works. But in the process of that curiosity-driven research, they generate a fair amount of intellectual property. And this is a very important differentiating point that I want to raise with the large part of the other tech markets. Biotech is purely IP-driven. The vast majority of investments that we make, as well as most other venture funds and hedge funds in this world, do so into patents. So if a technology is not patent protected, there's very little chance of actually getting funded, as compared to, say, again, the tech market, where quite often you do not want to patent so as to avoid disclosure. Because of this and because of the amount of investment that needs to go into a product before it can be translated and developed into a novel drug, another difference with the tech market is that there is very little garage innovation. None of you as the entrepreneurs and somebody from my team is a PhD, we couldn't get together and develop, come up with a great idea on our couch and make it into $1 billion startup. Everything is lab-based. That lab might be at a uni, it might be at a biotech, it might be at a big pharma, but nobody invests at a dream stage. Again, unlike tech. And this changes the dynamic in terms of the investment amounts, and we'll come to that a bit later. So at a moment when the technology is ready to start generating therapeutic assets, how does this actually look? So to start with, the first stage is the preclinical research. Preclinical research is comprised of two parts. The first part can also be called discovery or development. And this is from the moment you have a concept that something works and some early stage data to the moment where you exhaustively understand the mechanism of action in model systems. You typically start with laboratory testing, what we call in vitro, which means in test tubes, cell cultures, and so on and so forth. And then you proceed to animal testing. And animal testing is obviously a contentious point from the ethical perspective, and all of the developers in the biopharma space typically subscribe to the 3R paradigm, which means the replacement, reduction, and refinement of animal experimentation. So we try to make our experiments as productive as possible and damage as little animals as possible. And obviously everything is governed by the relevant ethics committees, which are quite powerful, by the way. So an important note about animal testing is this is one of the largest traps where generalist investors fall when assessing biotech opportunities. When an academic or a biotech startup comes to you and says, hey, we've got mouse data, the presumption is always, well, that's better than test tubes. But this is not necessarily so. A very important conundrum in biotech is what we call the external validity of animal models. So the real question is, how well does the animal model this drug is being evaluated in actually represent the disease they're trying to treat? A very well-known example of this is a vast majority of drugs that are designed to treat the diseases of the heart have been tested in mice, and in particular in very young mice, until people figured out in 2015 that if you injure the heart of a mouse before it turns 15 days old, it will regenerate of its own volition. And it was completely unknown before that. So essentially, quite a lot of data we've generated over the past 35 years or so in young mice is crap in, crap out. So none of that has any actual meaning. And so these things, unfortunately, happen. And it's very important to consider the fit between the animal model that somebody is trying to sell to you and the actual disease. So provided that this animal model is good and the data is robust, you can achieve what's called the proof of concept in vivo, i.e. proving that this particular drug or technological approach works in a relevant animal model. And this is the first major value inflection point in the life of any biotech project. With that in hand, people go into the second part of the preclinical trials or preclinical work. And this is in the biotech speak called the IND enabling studies. IND stands for an investigative new drug application, and that's a legal application you make to the US Food and Drug Administration to get a permission to run a clinical trial. And so the IND enabling studies are what enables you to file an IND. These are all the formal loops and hoops you got to jump through to get a permission from the FDA to run a clinical trial. It is close to that as well in Europe and other advanced countries. Beyond that, as soon as you get the IND, you go into clinical research. And there are typically 3 phases, 3 clinical trials that you have to run. The first finds the correct dose in healthy volunteers and tests that the drug is not toxic. The second proves the concept. It shows that there are beneficial effects of your drug. And then the third one compares the efficacy of your new drug against the standard of care. And typically all major economies require a phase 3 trial to include a center, a location on the ground. So you cannot approve a drug in Japan unless you trialed it in Japan. And so it is in Brazil and Russia and China and America and everywhere and around the world. So that's the real marketing authorization trial. If we flip this now into the actual business data, the preclinical testing, the preclinical spend for a given drug is typically below $25 million. It can range anywhere from 3 to 25. It's very hard to bring a drug to the clinical trials for less than 3 million, although we've seen this a couple of times, but that's the ballpark. And so typically the seed round, which is 5 to 10 million, and the Series A round, which is 15 to 25, or well, nowadays maybe to 50, pay for a number of drugs to get to the IND. And then throughout the clinical trials, the spend to the proof of concept is typically below 100 million, and then the spend on the phase 3 is another 1 to 500. You will often hear that number. It is a total. People often say it's about $1 billion to get a drug to approval. It is actually typically less than that nowadays, unless you count the marketing costs in. And if you do count marketing costs in, that's typically more than $1 billion. So that's the rough outline of how this operates. And then before I turn it over to Andrey to cover the growth of the current subsegments of the biotech market, I'll walk you through the 3 currently existing platforms that biotech consists of. So the first platform...
Dima, sorry for interrupting. There were 2 questions on the previous slide, so maybe it's more efficient just if we can quickly answer them. One was, if procedure is the same for US and Europe? You can see
by and large, yes. So all major countries have their own independent healthcare regulators. So you'll have to deal with them. You have to deal with the FDA. You have to deal with the EMA, European Medicines Agency, which covers all of the EU. You have to deal with the MHRA in the UK, China, Japan, Russia, Brazil, all have their own separate regulators. The process is pretty same, but they might have different requirements, slightly different requirements for the IND.
And the second question is it self-reported, or somebody independent checks the preclinical documentations, or how it's kind of organized?
All right, so this gets checked at several points. So you will file the proposed protocols to the ethics committee. The ethics committee will be the relevant ethics committee, either geographically located, if you're a company, or within your university or research center, if you do this at a research center. So they're the first typically to verify. Then any funders, such as the grant bodies or venture capital funds, will verify the protocol. For us, the trial protocols and the results are one of the largest diligence items. And then there is, obviously, the regulator will verify the protocol in great detail and look into the data. And then independent verification is very important. And for us as VCs, independent validation of the data is a key decision-making driver. So we really don't like to invest into unreplicated data, but we are quite fussy about this. I also see another question on what type of data in vitro versus in vivo, and how much should be sufficient, and would we require intellectual property? Yes, we would require intellectual property in near 100% cases. And as I said, the relevant data that we would consider the initial proof of concept and so invest in is actually very different disease by disease and modality by modality. with a cell therapy in cancer, we would and have invested at the test tube stage, and this is quite validating and representative. In a cell therapy in a cardiac disease, we would not invest short of big data, so large animal data in vivo. So it is different both from the drug modality and the therapeutic and the disease, the relevant disease area. Looking at the three generations of drugs, because I'm sure you've heard this sentence already by now. So the first gen is synthetic chemistry, or small molecules, as they're called in the BioTech lingo. And small molecules are the run-of-the-mill drugs all of us have taken at least once in our lives. So these are the pills and the drops and the creams and everything else. This is the bread and butter of pharma. 99% of drugs manufactured in the world by metric ton. They're really easy and cheap to make. They're effectively fine synthetic chemistry. So if you see a pharma manufacturing site, it is more or less like household chemistry manufacturing site, not very different. Just a bit finer than that. They're great in all things apart from two large problems. One I call the problem of the pill for the left ear. When you take a pill, and say a patient has an inflammation in the left ear, and they take a Nurofen pill, ibuprofen for those in America, and they take this pill, and the ibuprofen molecules go everywhere in their body, including their left ear and their right toe. And there is no way in hell you can design a pill that would only go to the left ear. This is technically impossible. So small molecules have their action throughout the body. And however much you want to contain that, it will be true to an extent. And then second problem is the vast majority of small molecules are actually destructive in the way they work. They bind to proteins and prevent them from doing their jobs. So small molecules are great as antibiotics, as anesthetics, as antivirals, and anti-many other things, but they're a bit less great in actually fixing stuff in the body. And fixing stuff in the body is what we really need in the case of chronic diseases we spoke about in the first slide. The second generation is what people call biologics. And they're called that because in the manufacturing chain that makes these drugs, there's somewhere inside it is a live microorganism that takes an active part in making it. It might be yeast, bacteria, or plant cells. Because of that, a biologics plant typically looks very much like a brewery. It's got steel vats and so forth. And from this perspective, biologics are great. They've added almost $1 trillion to the healthcare market. They're the top sold drugs in the world in dollars. The key platform there is antibodies. All of us know about antibodies now thanks to COVID. And antibodies are very, very powerful in that, unlike small molecules, they have very precise action. They're still destructive, but they work only on one thing in the body they're designed to work against. So that is the power of biologics. And the third platform, the one we exclusively focus at for Bio, and which is now very much the dish of the day, became so in the past 5 years, and Andrey will speak to that in a moment. That is all the technologies that can fix human biology. So things like gene therapy and cell therapy and RNA therapy, that instead of trying to destroy something in the whole body, are performing precisely programmable actions in precisely defined parts of the body, a certain cell type or a certain organ or a certain geographic place in the body. And we know exactly when, how, for how long, and how strongly these therapies do in the body. And this is a real paradigm shift because with these therapies, we are, for the first time in history, able to use tools rather than weapons, basically, on the body. And so as a part of the major achievements of our industry in the past 10 years, we've been able to what looks like permanently cure 11 genetic diseases using gene and cell therapy, a lot of which was done by portfolio companies. And to us, this is a really fundamental human achievement we're happy to talk about. And now, Andrey, over to you on the growth of the market.
Yeah. So yeah, what does this mean in dollar size or an amount of research? We can see if we talk only about the most recent wave of innovation that is coming to the market or to the biopharmaceutical market to advanced therapies. So as you can see, there are around 300,000 scientific publications happening in the world, for instance, in last year. This is how they split between different types of the research. And one publication means results of work of typically of one lab for several years, maybe up to 5 years. So this is not just an article who write in a journal. This is basically scientific. These are scientific results of the research of many people. So we can see that more than 300,000 new publications come over, and most of them can be patentable. So, and this really kind of how it translates into the business. So last year we saw more than 1,000 or 1.1 thousand clinical trials ongoing. This is what has translated from laboratory into the humans, and you can see the bottle. Here, how it goes from the phase 1, 2, 3, and then hits the market. And last year we saw 30 advanced therapies approved and allowed to be used in humans, and then the numbers are constantly growing. So business-wise, of course, the US is by far still the largest market for the innovation, biotechnology innovation. More than half of companies that develop new drugs and advanced therapies in this frontier world of innovation are based in the US. So out of 1,000 companies that we counted last year, more than 500 were based in the US. European Union is still a big chunk of the business, though if we compare the research that is happening in the European Union and in the US, it is comparable in amount of publications, but it is less translatable into the business. So Europeans are not that good into creating startups and businesses and developing laboratory ideas into the real actual business. And yeah, and 300 in the rest of the world is kind of only part of that. So dollar-wise, we saw last year that around $19 billion were invested in companies' development. Only this most recent segment of biotechnology innovations. Most of this money came from venture capital world and corporate partnerships. So pharmaceutical companies, they're also big investors in these startups. They not only finance the internal research, but they're also huge players on the venture capital market. So they invest directly in different startups and companies. They invest in different funds like ours to see the more innovations and to capture this value. And yeah, and then all these companies go all the way to the public market. And yeah, maybe Dima, you can show us what does this mean in next slide on the public market. So these are only the companies that became listed. So as probably many of you know, there are like hundreds of companies who go on the public market, but they still have zero revenues. They will never be profitable. Many of them will never have any single dollar of the commercial sales of drugs, but they still, the market caps of those companies are billions of dollars. And they have kind of ground behind that because they go through clinical trials, they create value and more de-risk the asset through coming from one stage to another, the more exponentially grows the market cap of the company. So you can see what's happening in the last year. So total market cap of the companies of advanced therapies only companies listed on the public markets went from 35 billion to almost 400 billion last year within last 7 years. And now we can account for 2 companies developing advanced therapies. This is almost half of the Nasdaq BioTech companies altogether. And this is kind of the size of the growing market. And the venture funds would typically, as Dima shown in clinical trials, we would invest in when value chain we are placed. So we would invest on most likely on preclinical stage, put few $1 million or few tens of millions of dollars, and then finance company all the way through the proof of concept on, in humans, which is phase 2, and then those companies would go either public and listed if there is a feasible financial model for those companies to develop drugs as a standalone companies, or they will be acquired by a big pharmaceutical company from the market or from the investors like us. And this would be the exit point for venture investors. Yeah, probably these are kind of more or less the slides we have. Do we want to answer other questions, or Natalia, do we have more questions coming? Yes, Dima, yeah, sorry. Back to you, probably, just to understand you and colleagues, the size of the drugs when what are we talking in dollars for these startups when they come to the market?
Also, just to give a sense of how these things develop over time. So, as Andrey said, this is still considered to be a relatively young market segment, despite the fantastic growth that is continuing, by the way, in 2021. When we started investing as we're buying into the segment back in 2014, as you would have seen, there were 4 public gene therapy companies. That was the grand extent of it, and there were no approved drugs, most importantly. So how quickly can it go? So 2 days ago was an anniversary. The US Food and Drug Administration approved the 100th monoclonal antibody drug. And this took 35 years, 100, okay? So as far as advanced therapies go, we actually have 17 approvals in 4 years. And this is much better pace and an accelerating pace as compared to what we've seen with the second generation. So we definitely hope for a rapid market uptake here. And it can be quite rapid because a lot of these drugs are addressing diseases where the patients have no therapeutic option. Spinraza or nusinersen is a great example of that. It came on the market in 2016, and it's an RNA therapy for spinal muscular atrophy type 1, an invariably lethal genetic disease that kills kids by about 3 years of age. Because the unmet need is so dire, in the first year, Spinraza had a market penetration of close to 40%. And right now, its annual sales are about 2.2 billion. It's the first blockbuster advanced therapy. This year there will be at least 3 more, and might be up to 6. We're awaiting sales data. The key point here, the market sizes might not be the tens of billions you're used to when looking at the top blockbuster antibodies, but very importantly, these are still sizable markets, and the uptake can be very rapid. So you can get to your peak sales in year 2 or year 3, which is way better than the conventional slow S-curve rollout of a small molecule drug, where you're looking at your peak sales in year 9 and you run out of patent in year 11. So that's basically the key take-home message here. As Andrey said, we're very happy to answer any questions.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to ask all participants to ask their questions in Zoom chat, and we already have questions. So I will try to group them. So first group is related to COVID. The first question is, how attractive are COVID vaccines startups? What do you think?
We have not made a single COVID investment, and I don't think we will. Vaccines are incredibly hard to make money on unless you're Pfizer. There is already one Pfizer, and it's making money on a vaccine. So beyond that, it is a rather attractive proposition for us. In terms of other vaccines and potential readiness for other infections, unfortunately, the vaccine and antibody markets suffer from a pure economics problem rather than a technology problem. There is no paying demand long term. There is not enough to guarantee that startups that develop vaccines against potentially dangerous infections, such as other coronaviruses, or startups developing drugs against drug-resistant bacteria, are compensated for their efforts. And no one wants to buy them because you cannot sell these drugs. So from this perspective, there is no paying demand. And the solution being thrown at the problem for the past 10 years has been to provide a supply stimulus by funding early stage research and giving the startups grant money. And as I'm sure you all would agree, supply stimuli don't help when you lack paying demand. So unfortunately, that's the core of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much. We have more questions. Very interesting question. What is your value add as a biotech VC aside from capital?
Great question. I'll start. Andrey, feel free to chime in. So every VC will give you a different answer on this, but there are several groups that you'd find feature the most. So first of all, we tend to pick startups where we can bring the most value add. This means that we're looking for something we call the risk fit. There are no perfect startups. All startups are broken one way or the other, but we're looking for the guys who are broken in a good way, in a way that we can fix. And the guys that are broken in a bad way, we're going to leave to whoever can fix that. So in terms of the particular value add, you would see from most VCs is A, help with HR, talent pooling, talent networks, working with high-flying HR firms that wouldn't work with startups individually, and advising on team and staffing problems. B, business development. All of us are as good as our big pharma address books are. Most of us, for bio included, have big pharma as investors. And so from this perspective, we would, on a regular basis, connect our portfolio companies with big pharma. Third, input into follow-on pipeline. Most of these startups need other assets. And as we are scouting and scouring the world for potential investments, sometimes we see things that would make sense as a company on their own, but would make a great add-on or bolt-on to one of our portfolio companies. And so this is definitely our duty to connect them to each other. Andrey, do you want to?
Yes, I would also add that. About the synergy we can bring to the startups, because when these companies are launched, most of them are launched as a project management company. So they're virtual. There would be a founder or two co-founders, but then the company does need a lot of functions, right? And it is extremely expensive to find good specialists, like a medical director, a specialist in the clinical trials. So this is where investors like venture funds come in place. Everybody would have venture partners, entrepreneurs in residence, and we would bring the best parts of the talents to those companies and split the time, working time and expenses of those great specialists between many startups. So, and then all of a sudden, instead of hiring 3 senior directors, each of whom wants $500,000 up to $1 million salary a year, we can provide them with the same quality of people, but because they just need to spend only one day in this company, they would support the same company with a full speed. So yeah, this is kind of important, and also that the companies go through different stages of the life, and the different qualities, management qualities are needed, because when the company is pretty early, this is mostly driven by science, and the scientific founder is usually good because like all these labs, laboratories, and so on. But then when the company matures, when they raise money, they go into clinical trials, then they do need different qualities in the team, like understanding how clinical trials design works. And this is where we can be helpful, because we have seen already like dozens, if not hundreds of those clinical trials. They failed, we failed as investors with them, and we can kind of manage and navigate the company toward the right directions. Not necessarily the good scientist is good, designer of clinical trials. And then as company comes to the market, they would need more typical qualities, the good CEO who can bring company public, good investment relations, and kind of this is also difficult for those smaller companies to kind of to find, because they just grown up from lab. So this kind of probably to summarize what we bring to the table to those companies, of course, and of course capital and connections.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very clear. I will try to combine several questions because I think they are related. What is your approach to company valuation when you consider investments? How do you define return on investments? And what's the range of ROI do you often look for?
Dima, do you want to start, or?
Well, I can start in terms of the ROI and modeling. So to start with modeling, so if you take the scales of precision of modeling, and on one side you take, I don't know, crypto, whatever, something that you think you can model. I think you can model crypto. No, maybe someone would disagree. And you take like actuarial modeling of all terminals in ports, which is super precise. BioTech is kind of in the middle, more graduating towards actuarial. We actually have very little speculation on our DCF. So the really good thing about, there are two things that we know really well. One thing that we know really well is the potential market, because there is a science called epidemiology, and there's a lot of, there are lots of scientists who actually spend their lives trying to answer questions such as, how many mononucleosis patients are there in Kenya today? Right, so that's kind of that type of question. And it gets published, it gets fed through professional databases, and this data is by and large readily available. So you know the epidemiology, there is devil in the detail. You need to understand what we call the care pathway. That means, how do these patients actually travel through the healthcare providers? What kind of drugs do they get assigned in the first line and the second line? How do they evolve over time? This all gets hardwired into the models. And then the second thing we know really well is the result of every single clinical trial ever reported is known. And we know which trials failed and which succeeded for which drugs and which indications. Because of this, we have weighted risks. We know chances of success for more or less any drug in any indication. And this allows us to risk adjust the NPV really well and risk adjust the costs. So by and large, modeling in biotech is fairly good as soon as you hit the late preclinical, early clinical stage, when the cumulative probabilities of success become more than 10%. So that's on how we model. And in terms of the target return, at the seed stage, you target 10 to 20x. On a Series A, you target a 5 to 10. On a B, you target 2 to 5, depending on how crossover is your B.
Yeah, so kind of just to add what Dima has said, surprisingly enough, in biotech, though it is a bit risky from a scientific standpoint of view, because drugs do fail and success rate of every single drug is less than 50% from entering the clinical trials or coming to the market. But still, we as investor, we can model pretty well. So kind of, and we can build a financial model for any startup that comes to us without even kind of asking them. We would ask them, okay, guys, what do you think where your technology works? What kind of diseases you think it will be working in? But then it will be maybe a week of work of our analysts just to model this company. And then we do just pretty standard NPV, DCF, and then we adjust statistical probabilities to each disease or modality at each stage, probability of why it fails. And then kind of we can arrive to pretty well to the valuation of this company, and then this is what we would offer as investors to the founders, and then of course you will start this game. So is this founder connected well enough? What he or she wants? Do they have offers on the table? And then again, we are not in the private equity world, so the biotech is a very club investment world. So everybody's cooperating. Big pharmaceutical companies co-investing together all the time. They pay royalties to each other. We as a fund would never invest alone in a startup because I mean, they burn hundreds of millions of dollars before they can become profitable. And this is the ticket size that can be paid only by a few funds in the world. So that's why we still want to have 2-3 good investors around the table when we invest in a company. Yeah, and there was a very good question. Is a place where startup is created is important or not? Like if it's Europe, US, Eastern Europe, or Japan. Yes, it's important, of course, from the standpoint of view of the quality of people you can find, or initial research, where it comes from, how reliable it is it patentable, and so on. But then the more important is that to what markets do you go? And unfortunately, for smaller markets like smaller countries, it's almost useless to try to develop the drug only for that particular market. So it's always like export build. Even if you establish your biotech startup somewhere in a smaller country, you still want to register it in the European Union at least, or in the US, and then you would add your home country. So yes, it is still important.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes, thank you. I also see a related question. Probably you may repeat it or elaborate more. When you evaluate a potential biotech startup, what are the top 5 criteria to consider, which you consider most important, if you can elaborate this?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Data. Okay, so well, it's not that easy, but it's pretty close. So data is definitely, but number one, data is king by far. Everything else to a degree can be fixed. If the data doesn't give you warm and fuzzy feelings, just walk away. The difference between the private and the public guys is when you look at the public guys, you only have to be concerned with how good the data is, right? Because to lie in an S1 is a crime. When you look at the private guys, it is actually not a crime for them to omit or lie or mislead you and so on and so forth in many cases. And so from this perspective, you also have to be concerned with how real the data is. Like, am I looking at something that actually came out of the lab, or did just somebody draw this poorly? So, and you'd be amazed at how often does that happen. So that's the data part. Second part, people. So one of the most important things for us is the depth of tracking in history. We really like the stories that we can track for a while. Like if we know the academic and know what they're up to, and we can interact with them for a couple of years and then pick the product out when we think it's matured, that's great, because we can also see them dynamically. And it's even better in terms of assessing, like when we look at things that go public for a hedge fund, we prefer to have been in their data room for the Series A and the Series B, and to have known them for a while. And this gives us the view on their execution history. We know what they promised back then and what they delivered and how it all worked out. So that is really important to us as well. So that's point number 2. Number 3, manufacturing. This is a non-issue for small molecules. It can be an issue for biologics, but quite rarely. It is a huge risk and a huge issue for advanced therapy. So this is actually more important than whether it's going to work. Because if you're looking at an advanced therapy and it passed muster in preclinical trials, it will most likely work. The thing you don't know about this is whether you'll be able to make enough, and also whether it will be safe. So these are the 2 key risks. Fourth, manufacturing. Fourth, regulatory. So what's the regulatory path like? What do we need to get into the clinic? And so on and so forth. And the 5th, refinancing risk. So with the amount of money they're asking for and we're prepared to put in, are they able, with a good amount of leeway, to achieve a meaningful de-risking event that will allow them to raise the next round? Sometimes you can get a really powerful syndicate with several billion around the table, and then the refinancing risk goes away. But in general, these are the 5 key risks we assess.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, there was an interesting question.
Yes, yes.
I can pick up this question maybe and ask you. So why we were talking about the advanced therapies, and these are mostly like rare diseases or genetic diseases, right? And the very first slide you showed was that the largest cause of death is cardiac disease. I mean, why nobody is kind of, why don't you see hundreds and hundreds of startups working there?
Great question. So why don't you see hundreds and hundreds of startups in small molecules in cardiac disease? That's because they, by and large, failed, okay? Small molecules for the heart and the brain are really hard to develop because the heart and the brain actively protect themselves. They pump stuff out and they don't really want to get what you're trying to give them. In terms of advanced therapies, so the stuff we're interested in, baby steps. There's lots of gene therapies and cell therapies for rare diseases in the heart. They don't work as well as we'd like them to thus far, but as for bio, for example, we're hugely interested in the heart gene therapy, and we're definitely going in that direction. And give it another 5-10 years, I think we'll be at a junction where we'll have a chance of tackling some pretty major cardiac indication as well. I think hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and in general cardiomyopathies will be the first to fall.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Also, a very practical question for those of us who don't have a background in biology or medicine, how do you recommend getting up to speed in biotech investing?
Andrey, you want to take that?
Interesting question. I would recommend not to invest at all. Only
take LP positions.
Yeah, only through LP positions or through other funds, because it takes time to build your expertise, and then you still need to have a team around to kind of analyze where you invest, and you would want to have capabilities. One good graduate from one of the good business schools who knows how to evaluate or build financial models, but then you also need to understand some biologists or doctors around, people who can actually read scientific article and say, look, it is something new. But so you need to build this expertise around, and then kind of, yeah, the general approach would be, if you try to pick up the companies and invest in separate of them, you would most likely, it will be like gamble. So yeah, it's a bit specialized world, and you want to have some expertise. Get together with your friend from science. They will read articles. You would build financial risk-adjusted models. They will check what this company disease population would be the price, and then that's pretty much what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but there are also public instruments on the stock market. I mean, ETFs and public, large public companies. So probably you can share your view on these instruments, or still you think you need special expertise to participate, even with ETFs?
To choose funds, probably not, just common sense. Of course, past performance is not prediction of future performance, but look at these people, who they are, who are actual managers of that fund. Does it make sense, the strategy, what they do? Do they just follow the crowd, or they have some standalone and kind of they're placed in the market? So how do they select stocks? Yeah, you don't need to have medical education to choose your ETF. But yeah, you can invest.
And to add to that, one important thing and there was a question in the chat that we can't really answer, but I can allude to it, and you'll see why. So somebody asked about Biogen and the Alzheimer's drug. So when people invest on the public markets, they like to go for big pharma, because big pharma look like they're pretty big, right? They're like, their market caps are measured in hundreds of billions, and they pay good dividends quite often, and so on and so forth. But there's an important thing to understand, that actually picking big pharma stocks on your own can be quite dangerous. The reason is that not all big pharma are born equal. Quite a lot of them actually have 50, 60, 70% of their balance sheets and revenues in one drug. And so when that drug falls off the cliff, which all drugs do sooner rather than later, because of the IP running out, these guys are in for a hell of a ride, and you with them if you stick around in the stock. If you look at the Biogen stock price in response to the trials and tribulations of the aforementioned Alzheimer's drug, you'll see very clearly what I'm talking about. And Biogen is a true big pharma. They've got quite a number of products. So do not, so people think that big pharma are kind of like boring, kind of think like car makers, right? These things should be priced on their sales, and that is pretty much it, but not really. They can also be quite arcanely priced on the successes and failures of single products or very low numbers of products. So in general, if you just want generalist exposure, an ETF on the Nasdaq Biotechnology Index is your safest bet. That definitely requires no thought process whatsoever beyond clicking a button in your broker.
Yeah, just the more important, just to see what fees they will charge you for just investing in indices. Do they overcharge and stuff like that? There is an interesting question: is do you see crowdfunding as competition in biotech and to VC? Actually, you would be surprised. Yes, we see a little bit of crowdfunding, but I don't see that much of crowdfunding. Dima, did you meet from your experience? Because it's
I saw noticeable crowdfunding only in one company, and that company was really bad. so and it crowdfunded a lot, all right? And a lot of the health stuff, like UBiome crowdfunded, I think, and that was a complete disaster. Yeah, personally, I don't really like crowdfunding in biotech, especially in therapeutics, because I mean the risk is so high, it just feels unfair.
The as close as crowdfunding we saw, and I saw, is this would be chains of or networks of angels who would invest, like we have seen, like in Michigan or in separate states of the United States. But you still need a core, if not GP, but the leader of this crowd, and who would invest his personal or her personal money, at least a few $1 million, and then they would have a network of the friends and angels, 5 or maybe 100 or 1,000 people, and then you spread the word. This is the only as closest to successful model in crowdfunding we have seen. So, but not definitely not for internet. So you want somebody who would take lead and take responsibility and invest their own money kind of a lot. And then you would be comfortable to co-invest. And of course, what you see as crowdfunding, of course, with these big funds, and there is a bunch of friends and family who co-invest with them, but it's not crowdfunding, it's just a follow-up. How does SPAC affects the biotech investment ecosystem?
That's actually an interesting one. All right, so I think about 25% of all SPACs are healthcare. These were the numbers a month ago. The crazy started a bit earlier than the rest of the crazy. So I'd probably say December 19, thereabouts. We got the first SPAC marketed to us in summer 19. And then so the SPAC market in healthcare very quickly kind of separated into 2 tiers. So the top tier, the top tier or tier 1 SPACs are all sponsored by the largest crossover funds. So RA Capital, Equire One, Orbimed, Perceptive Advisors, Cormoran. No, folks like those have 2, 3 SPACs sometimes. They really changed the game because as the largest crossover investors in the space, they can do several things that other SPAC sponsors can't. First and foremost, in a biotech world, a SPAC always has a pipe as a part of the D-SPAC to guarantee that a company has enough cash. Because as I'm sure you know, in the US, you can leave the SPAC. You can vote yes, but you can take the money away. Healthcare SPACs never fail to vote, but quite sometimes the people leave. So there's always a pipe. And the tier 1 SPAC sponsors can put forward the 20, 30 million check as a part of the pipe upfront. They say upfront, this is what we're going to put in. They also give no warrant coverage and so on and so forth. So their financial conditions are much better than the rest of the tier, than the tier 2. And so all the top deals are basically made by the tier 1 SPACs, all the best deals. So right now, from a startup perspective, I'd estimate there's about 35 SPACs in the market worth talking to, and the rest are.
And for us, I would add a little bit, for us as investor, this SPAC is, we would consider it just a good shortcut to IPO, because if the company, our portfolio company, would want to go public, this is still 6 to 9 months process, drafting all these S-funds, testing the water, finding bankers and so on. And then if you find a good SPAC and achieve good valuation, you can kind of list your company pretty quickly with good investors base. If you're looking from the venture world, for us, it's one additional maybe route to exit for our portfolio companies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. We have a lot of questions. I will try to pick one. How do you scout for potential targets? It's a very interesting question.
Yes. So thus, again, here, poll 10 different VCs, you'll get 10 different answers. It depends a lot on what deal phenotype are actually looking for. So those who would do classic ventures, so Series A, as their bread and butter, would typically utilize the investor club. So just talking to their peers, talking to the pharma, screening the seed deals, and going to investor conferences. So these are the classic kind of things. Things get a bit more interesting when, like us, you're a seed investor, or even worse, a venture creation investor, so you build companies in-house. There are a number of approaches here. One thing you could do is focus on one source of companies. For example, there is a very, very famous fund on the West Coast called Canaan, which is one of the oldest and largest healthcare funds, and they specialize on spinning stuff out of big pharma. And they're really, really good at it. And so that's their way of scouting. They just keep tabs on what big pharma wants to get rid of. Others, like say, it would take the UK, what used to be Imperial Innovation and became part of the IP group, or the Oxford University, what they're called, partners, or Oxford University Innovation, something. Basically, these could be hundreds of millions funds focused on just one unit. And you can run a fund like that, but you better be a generalist, because it's very unlikely you'll have enough any kind of specialist deal flow to build a good portfolio. Another approach is what some of the heavy hitter funds do, is basically focus on the highest profile scientists you can find. So go and take all the Nobel Prize winners you can reach and build companies with them. I'm a bit less optimistic about that approach, but you can do that. And then there's another one, which you could call proactive, and that is basically kind of knowing what you actually want. So having your own strategy of some sort, that's what we do. And a number of other folks do as well. So this is when you say, okay, we are aware of these kinds of healthcare, technological, or medical problems, and we think that these kinds of technologies can actually solve these. Let's go out and look for the best one. And then you run a beauty contest between everything you can find, and then you either back a startup or you build a company. So in terms of the technicalities, this basically means you got to go to the universities and institutes around the world for very often, build relationships with academics and the tech transfer offices, as well as your peer early stage investors, and invest time, energy, and money in doing that. We estimate from where we sit for bio is about, now we're in our 7th year. Right now we see 90% of all advanced therapies deal flow in Europe. It took us about, I would say, 5.5 years together. So if you're thinking about building a new scouting engine, that's, I'd estimate, just about as long as it will take.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that we have run out of time, and thank you very much for your time and for this great discussion, very insightful. Maybe you can tell us what is the best way to connect with you if participants want to ask more questions or want in-person connection. So if possible, maybe give this.
Yeah, we dropped our emails in the chat, so we're pretty easy to reach. Just drop us an email.
Yes, yes. So
and the alumni
please
can find me in databases. So just my email would be akozlov@chicagobooth.edu.
Yeah.
So with Dima
Yeah,
dropped our emails in the chat, or ask Natalia if you have her contacts here. You should have.
yes.
Or Jenny,
Yes.
or Jenny, whatever.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Dmitry. Thank you very much, Andrey. I'm very happy for today's event, and thank you all, guys. Have a great day, and yeah, good luck. Good luck.
Goodbye.
Bye bye. Thank you, everyone.